Hello, Dr. Waitinas. Thank you so much for taking the time to evaluate my presentation handout assignment. Today we're going to be talking about Hast never come to thee an hour. Hast never come to thee an hour, a sudden gleam divine, precipitating, bursting all these bubbles, fashions, wealth? These eager business aims, books, politics, art, amours, to utter nothingness. This is a very beautiful poem by Walt Whitman, one of his shorter ones. And though it's short, there is a lot of meaning that was applicable back then as it is today. And here on the screen, we can see just a screenshot of this text as it's found in the Whitman archive, and also a photograph of Whitman, also from the archive. My argument today is that Whitman subverts the commonly held notion that capitalism and worldly accumulation bring lasting happiness. Whitman believed that when a person dies, the capitalistic and business pursuit of one's career is often rendered worthless. Whitman is speaking universally. His thoughts were as applicable in 1892 as they are today in 2019. Just to sort of unpack some key terms, Hast, to possess, a quality, tendency, ability, etc., as an attribute or characteristic. It's sort of like an old-fashioned way of saying have. Now, amours, love, affection, friendship, and that's an interesting one because we're going to be talking about that a bit more later because there are some alternate definitions that the OED provides that can have some different implications. Now, also precipitate, to fall suddenly or violently into a particular state or condition, especially an undesirable one, to come suddenly to a lower position. And lastly, I wanted to define thee. Now, the OED has a couple definitions, but two that were very applicable are as direct object thyself, or as indirect object, to or for thyself. And the reason why this is interesting is because Whitman uses thee in reference to all people. So people himself, other people, those that were living in the late 1800s, and he knew that there would be people reading that long after he had passed, which we are today. And that's why it's particularly significant, and I believe it's very valuable. I wanted to first clear up a bit of confusion. So Whitman is not speaking out against books, politics, art, or amours. He was very involved with each of those components at multiple junctures throughout his lifetime. But he is speaking out against such acts as they pertain to business aims. And so we might want to consider what is a business aim. And it is a capitalistic pursuit, something that involves financially motivated goals, or worldly or materialistic success. After the Civil War, Whitman spoke out against such factors. He was not a fan of greed, and he noticed it around him often. And he believed that it was hurting his country. He commented in Democratic Vistas that never was there perhaps more hollowness at heart than at present, and here in the United States. Genuine belief seems to have left us. The underlying principles of the states are not honestly believed in, for all this hectic glow and these melodramatic screamings, nor is humanity itself believed in. Jumping into the four components that Whitman lists in this poem, we can see that the first one that he references as something that would amount to utter nothingness if pursued through the lens of business aims would be books. And this is particularly interesting because, as we know, Whitman was a bookmaker. He was fascinated with all aspects of the profession. He was involved with the content, the physical dimensions of it, the color and illustrations, the process of binding it together. And also he was aware of the sales process, because back then and today that often is indicative of a book's popularity and demand for reproduction. Ed Folsom notes in his publication that Whitman actually considered himself a bookmaker more than an author. He's quoted to say, "I sometimes find myself more interested in bookmaking than in book writing." He once said, "The way books are made, that always excites my curiosity. The way books are written, that only attracts me once in a great while." The next area that Whitman references in this poem is politics. And one could argue that Whitman was involved in the political process to some degree during his time, but we know from studying his publications and his thoughts that he was an advocate for democracy. And at the time, he didn't have as much faith in the political process as he did poets and orators and literacy. He goes on to say in Democratic Vistas that also a great breed of orators will one day spread over the United States and be continued. Blessed are the people where, the nation's unity and identity preserved at all hazards, strong emergencies throes occur. Strong emergencies will continually occur in America and will be provided for. Such orators are wanted as have never yet been heard upon the earth. And as we can see, our nation has seen many strong emergencies, and Whitman's prediction with that has been absolutely correct. The next area is art. And one could argue that Whitman's writing and the way in which he conveyed his thoughts and feelings through writing and bookmaking, that there is a form of artistry involved in that. But I believe for the sake of this poem, he was referencing art as painters and similar artists in that area. And on the Whitman Archive, I found a very fascinating component from scholar Brian Richards, and he commented on the friendship of Walt Whitman and Thomas Eakins, who was an artist back during that time period. Richards notes that the two men shared not only a friendship and mutual respect, but an artistic vision of American democracy grounded in realism. And there is a painting Thomas Eakins made of Whitman. And so art, in terms of pursuing a business aim or business interest, as this poem suggests, could be problematic. But art, when pursued through the lens of personal expression and because it's satisfying someone's personal interest, as assumed it was with Whitman and with Eakins, it could be particularly valuable. The last component is amours, and so the OED has a couple definitions. One of them is the tender affections, love towards one of the opposite sex. Another is an illicit love affair and intrigue. So those two things jumped out at me as possibly conflicting, so it could be two components at once. As we know, Whitman had many amorous relationships with men and women, and it led me to wonder what could Whitman have been referring to when he references eager business aims in conjunction with amours that would resultingly amount to nothingness. And the one thing that came to mind was prostitution. Now, last summer, in preparation for our Whitman course, I read the Lives and Legacies series by David S. Reynolds. And I remembered a very particular line in which Reynolds commented on Whitman's views on prostitution. It was common during his time, and people of all different socioeconomic levels took part in it. And one of the things that Reynolds commented on was that Whitman was appalled by the way prostitution was conducted in New York, and that's as he observed it. And he also went on to say that one of Whitman's aims in his poetry was to extend a generous hand to the victims of deceitful men. So that's particularly interesting as it shows amours in relation to eager business aims. Coming into my conclusions, I've come to the reasoning that Whitman's involvement in such matters, as we can see in books, art, politics, and amours, was that he was driven by a personal interest, an altruism, and a strong sense of civil obligation. Whitman was not motivated by eager business aims, and as a result, his life work has not amounted to utter nothingness. To kind of unpack a few discussion questions that we can talk about here, take a look at the handout at the implications heading. Notice some of the possible ways in which one could use books, politics, art, and amours for business aims that could result in utter nothingness. Can you think of any other ways in which business aims could result in utter nothingness? Who comes to mind when you think of those who are motivated by eager business aims? Will everyone who is driven by eager business aims have life work that will amount to nothing? Or is Whitman giving readers a cautionary sense of forewarning? And to provide a contrasting position, can someone be motivated by eager business aims and still have meaningful connections to books, politics, art, and amours? And lastly, do you think Whitman had a specific person or people in mind when he wrote, "Hast never come to thee an hour"? Thank you so much for watching my presentation.